Hi everyone, welcome to the second episode in our Foundation Trainee Pharmacist podcast series. My name's Amir and I'm from the RPS and I'm joined by Khalid today. Khalid, do you want to do a quick intro?
Yeah, my name's Khalid Khan. I'm the training lead for foundation training at Iman Healthcare, which is a community pharmacy chain. And I'm also a training program director at Health Education, involved in foundation training.
Thanks, Khalid. The topic of today's episode is the foundation training pharmacists learning outcomes. And really, I suppose I'd be really keen to hear from Khalid his views on why they're so important and any top tips that you can provide on how to gather evidence and how you can record evidence against some of these learning outcomes. So I suppose, Khalid, the first question that I've got for you is, what are they? What are the learning outcomes?
So the learning outcomes, if we've got any supervisors watching this, they used to be called the performance standards, and before them they were called competencies. And the learning outcomes basically are what the GPHC want you to demonstrate that you can do during your training year. So if you think about it, during your year, you're going to be assessed in two different ways. You've got the GPHC, which will assess your clinical knowledge and your decision-making skills via the assessment at the end of the year, which all trainees will be well aware of and probably, fixated upon and just thinking about that. But what kind of trainees don't realise is that the GPHC also expects you to be assessing in another way, and this is where they want your designated supervisor to see how you're performing against the learning outcomes. So there are actually 55 learning outcomes, but one of them's prescribing, so that's been kind of put on hold at the moment. So what they call the interim learning outcomes. So there's 54 interim learning outcomes. And these are kind of behaviours and skills that you need to demonstrate throughout the year and show a level of competency. And you have to show it reliably and repeatedly, is the phrase, throughout the year. And when you demonstrate that, then your supervisor can say, yes, my trainer has demonstrated they can perform this skill, or they have that knowledge. And you'll have those marks off throughout the year, and by the end of the year you need to get them all marked off, and they are consequential. So if you get to your, for example, 39-week review, and you don't get, if you don't have a sufficient amount of them, and there's no magic number, but if you don't have a sufficient amount of them marked off, then your supervisor can actually stop you sitting the exam. So that's really important. The other thing to remember is that your learning outcomes can be unsigned. So we talked about this phrase, reliably and repeatedly. You can get, for example, behaving in a professional manner, get it signed off at 13 weeks or 26 weeks. But if you all of a sudden start, swearing at your patients and stuff like that and falling out with your staff, then your supervisor can actually untick that box, and then you're back having to demonstrate that you can do it. So what can even happen is that a trainee can have a satisfactory sign-off at 39 weeks, can sit the exam, but then if they don't meet those remaining learning outcomes, even if they've passed the exam, they can still be prevented from joining the registering practice as a pharmacist if they've not met these outcomes. So that's how important these outcomes are. In fact, if I can, if I just do a little screen share, so you can see that's the Trainee Pharmacist Foundation Year Programme website done by HEE. There's lots of information on the new changes. So, for example, this year, just to go a little bit off topic, there's been some terminology changes. So, pre-registration trainees are now called trainee pharmacists. Tutors are now called designated supervisors. The pre-registration year is called the foundation year now, foundation training year. And the big one is that your performance standards that we mentioned have been changed to learning outcomes. The GPC have produced a really helpful document, this one here, which lists the previous standards. So, for example, this is A1.7, take responsibility for and accept outcomes of your own decisions. So if you've got a supervisor who's not quite sure about the new learning outcomes, not quite sure how to assess, it'd be quite handy to point them to this document here, which has the new learning outcomes. So learning outcomes 18, 19, 20, 51. You can map them backwards to the old performance standards, so they can kind of get in their heads and reorientate themselves in terms of what that standard is asking for. So that's a really handy one. I don't know if we can put links in for later, possibly, that we can share on the website, and that'd be quite useful, I think.
Absolutely. So some of this stuff is on the RPS website as well.
Great.
And we will, as you've said, reference the two.
Yeah, and just one last thing is that in terms of what level you need to show these learning outcomes to, most of them, the big difference between the performance standards and the learning outcomes as well is that the performance standards are very specific to the pre-registration year alone, whereas the learning outcomes are now used for the whole span of education. So from the first year of the pharmacy degree up until the end of the foundation training year. And the kind of tool we use is Miller's triangle to assess where the trainee should be. So at university, you'll be expected to be in the knows section or knows how, and potentially show. So if you're doing an OSCE, for example, you're showing how you're doing a skill. Whereas at foundation training level, most, not all, but most of the learning outcomes you need to show that you can do them in a live situation with real people and real situations. There are a few though, and this is why it's worth going through them, that are still at shows how and does. So if you go through those, make yourself familiar, you'll understand what kind of level you're having to perform those standards at.
Brilliant, thanks Khalid. I think for me, the bit that I would just add to that is, if you think of your training year as two parts. So the first is you need to be able to demonstrate that you've got the knowledge, and that's what the exam is there for. I think for me, the learning outcomes is to be able to demonstrate that you are able to behave in a manner that is in keeping with the pharmacy profession, and that's what the learning outcomes are for. Khalid, would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting because a trainee will go into the year and they'll, in their head, the most important thing is the exam from day one. Whereas if you speak to a supervisor, for them, actually, the most important thing are the learning outcomes and the behaviours. Can you behave and function as a pharmacist independently? And trying to get through to trainees to make them understand is quite difficult, because the exam is very high stakes, isn't it?
Yeah.
But the way I like to explain it is that the exam is important, no doubt about it, because without passing it, you can't get through. But it's a gateway thing, isn't it? It's one day, you pass the exam and it's done. But then you've got your career to look ahead at, which is 20, 30, 40 years, whatever. And I'm really glad they changed the terminology from the pre-registration year to foundation year, because that's exactly what it is. It's about building your foundations as a pharmacist, isn't it? And it's building your foundations as a pharmacist for that 20, 30, 40 year career you're going to have afterwards. And if you don't spend this year, because it's the only year you're going to have really, where you're going to have another pharmacist with you, looking after you, responsible for you, you can ask questions, make mistakes, and have that safety net. If you don't make use of that year properly now, once you pass that exam and all of a sudden you're on the register and you're on your own, then you're going to feel very lost and quite vulnerable and not very confident. And that's not a place that you want to be in. And what we find is the trainees who use this year to build their foundation and get as much experience as possible and build those skills, tend to hit the ground running when they become a pharmacist. They get going quicker, they're much more confident, but also they tend to progress in their career quicker at an earlier stage as well, because they are more confident and they're applying the skills and they're just working better. So there's a lot of emphasis and there's a lot of weight about building those skills through the year and being confident for when you qualify.
Thanks, Khalid. I suppose with that then, do you have any tips on how you should gather and record evidence for those learning outcomes? Because obviously with there being 55/54, I mean, and you said that the onus and responsibility is on both the trainee and the supervisor to ensure that the trainee is competent. How does one go about demonstrating that they should be signed off against X learning outcomes?
Yeah. I mean, like you said, the onus isn't on both to make sure that the trainee is competent, but the onus is definitely on the trainee to prove that they're competent and demonstrate that they're competent to the supervisor. It's interesting that, I mean, I've sat in reviews myself before as a supervisor, where the trainees come with very little evidence and they're relying on persuasion and charm to get me to sign off. Sign off. I was kind of saying, yeah, but I can do it. And what we need to see is evidence. So the first thing that a trainee needs to do is become familiar with those learning outcomes. So literally read through them and know what the GPS is expecting from you. Because if you don't know what those learning outcomes are and not familiar with them, then while you're working, you're not going to think, oh, I've just been in this scenario and actually I've just demonstrated, that, you might not know which number it is, but you remember the kind of the concept of that learning outcome. So when you're in that situation and you understand and you kind of know what those learning outcomes are, when you're in a scenario, you'll think, oh, I've just done that. Then what you want to do is make a note of it, so you don't forget it. Now, you probably won't be able to write up that piece of evidence fully, and post it onto your portfolio for your supervisor. What you can do is, and most trainees who are successful recommend having a notebook, a little notepad with them, where you make notes. And in that notebook, you might put in the scenarios that you can write up later, any questions that you've got, any queries that you might want to speak to your supervisor about, and now might not be the right time. So having that notebook has multiple benefits. But in terms of learning outcomes, you can make notes of your evidences and get those written up as soon as you can and get those signed off. I would recommend a couple of pieces of evidence every week, kind of drip feed it through to your supervisor, ask your supervisor how they want it done. But like I said, now we've got this e-portfolio, which is on the training website I mentioned before, which the RPS is actually coordinating. So if you upload all your evidence on there, get your supervisor to check them. That's the way to kind of plow through these. And one piece of advice that we've been giving for years, regardless of what these outcomes are called, is it's about quality rather than quantity. So if you can get one really good piece of evidence, one really good scenario, which captures lots of different learning outcomes, your supervisor will be very pleased with that, because they don't have to read lots of different pieces of evidence. But you can actually get through your outcomes much quicker, rather than having a fairly kind of basic, flimsy piece of evidence, which is mapped to maybe one learning outcome. It's not that great, and your supervisor won't be very, very grateful either. So that's just one thing to bear in mind. Another thing about when you write up your evidence is, have a kind of, there's usually a vague structure in terms of, what happened, what went well, what could have been done better, what did you learn from it, and what sort of developmental needs you can have afterwards. And that's what you should be getting from your scenarios and your evidences as well.
And you mentioned like drip feeding to your supervisor. I really often and frequently hear people saying to me, Amir, I've got my learning review, my progress review coming up, and I need to get X% of these learning outcomes signed off. Do you have a view on that? Is that the right approach? Is that the wrong approach?
It's definitely the wrong approach. It's not about numbers, not at the beginning anyway, for a number of reasons. If what usually happens is either people look at the learning outcomes and divide them up. They kind of go, well, I've got this many reviews, so I've got 3 reviews, and so I need to get 30% or whatever in each one. Well, it doesn't quite work like that, because for a start, number one, at the beginning, it's going to be quite a steep learning curve. So you might meet lots of standards, but conversely, you might not meet many standards because you're still learning. So you're still building up the evidence to meet those learning outcomes. What might happen is actually when you get to around week 26, you might have a bigger chunk because you've just developed and matured more. So at the beginning, you may not get many sign-off and this is the other thing, which is if you're comparing yourself with your friends, for example, so you might have had a friend who did their review the week before and they got signed off on 20, 30 learning outcomes. And if you're going in with that expectation, but let's say you've never worked in pharmacy before, you've never had a job before, everything is new to you, you're not going to get that many learning outcomes signed off, but you're comparing apples and oranges. It's not a fair comparison. So you need to manage your expectations as a trainee going into these reviews, and forget about the number. The GPA doesn't state a number. Nobody ever states a number. I don't know where these numbers come from. They come from somewhere. It's not from any official source. But it's about thinking about you, yourself, your own situation, and your own development. And it's about, just being very pragmatic. This is what I've done. These are my evidences. And, you'll get signed off on what you'll get signed off on. The most important thing is really what you do with that. It's not about having in your head how many you're going to get signed off. It's about thinking, right, once I found out how many I've got signed off, and once I found out the review where I am, it's about having the action plan, thinking, what do I do next? How do I identify my gaps? And what do I need to do to plug those gaps? That's the thing that you should be focusing on.
Thanks. If I remember correctly, there's four domains. Is that right, for the learning outcomes? They're split into patient-centered care and collaboration, professional practice, leadership and management, and education and research. And another thing that I often hear is that one domain is harder than the other. Do you have a view on that?
That's an interesting one. And I've never, I think when I've, so in the old days, it was slightly different. Well, the old days, last year, you had slightly different domains, and they probably made, I suppose we became familiar with them. And I suppose for different trainees, certain domains will be harder,
Exactly.
depending on their natural skill set or their experience. So, person-centered care might come really natural to somebody, research, etc., might not come naturally, and vice versa. So I suppose the good thing about the domains in that sense is that it allows a supervisor to have a look at a trainee and think, well, I can see the strong here, I can see the weak here, and the trainee can see that. And then it becomes easier again when you talk about action planning and identifying where you're weak and identifying how you address those weaknesses. Straight away, those domains start to highlight that. So, before it used to be interpersonal skills or medicines and health, two very different things. So people are very good with knowledge and recalling knowledge about medicines, etc., and conditions, but not great with talking to people. Two very, very different skill sets. So it's not about one domain being hard for everyone. It's about the individual, isn't it?
Thanks, Khalid. So it would be a good time to summarize, I suppose, some of those top tips that we've said. So the first top tip for those supervisors that are listening is that there's been a change in terminology here across the whole GPHC learning experience, I suppose, for those who are foundation trainees. And with that in mind, the learning outcomes is new terminology. They used to be called performance standards, and even before that, they were called competencies. Khalid mentioned it doesn't actually really matter what they're called. They're called learning outcomes now, but really the purpose of them is to measure and demonstrate your competence as a pharmacist. So if you think of the exam being split into two parts, you've got this learning outcomes piece, and then you've got the exam piece. The learning outcomes is there to be able to demonstrate that you can act and behave as a pharmacist, and really it's the foundation trainee's opportunity to demonstrate that you are behaving and acting in a certain way to your designated supervisor. Now, the learning outcomes are mapped to 4 domains or themes, as it were, and we know from experience that some of those domains and themes individuals and trainees find harder to get ticked off other than others. Now, Khalid mentioned this is about preparing in advance for meetings with your designated supervisor and being familiar with the learning outcomes. The more you're familiar with them, the more you're going to know what you're able to get signed off quickly and what you may need some support with. When you're having those regular check-ins with your supervisors, it's definitely about the quality and not about the quantity of them. You will have an opportunity throughout the year to check them off. And I think the last thing that I really want to say around learning outcomes is something that Khalid's already mentioned, which is just be really familiar with them. Ensure you know what they are and try and identify where you're able to sign them off throughout the year. So thank you so much for listening. Our next series is on your first progress review, and hopefully what we've discussed today on the learning outcomes will help when it comes to your first progress review. Thanks, Khalid. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm Amir from the RPS.